Hi, this is Clayton K. Hanlust. This is History 1302, and we are on Lecture 7, the Progressive Era. Progressive Era is literally Lecture 1 in this second module for the class, or second unit for the class. So by the time you start watching this video, you should have taken all of the tests and exams and quizzes for Module 1, and now you're ready to move on to Module 2. So the Progressive Era. This is an era that marks a distinct period in American history, particularly in History 1302. One of the forces that shapes history, whether we like to admit this or not, is accident. And one of those accidents actually occurred on September 6th, 1901. William McKinley, the President of the United States, was attending a World Fair in Buffalo, New York. He had with him approximately 50 U.S. military personnel and Secret Service agents who were protecting him. And yet somehow a man named Leon Czolgosz was able to walk up to McKinley in a receiving line, shake his hand, and then able to fire a pistol at McKinley at point blank range. Czolgosz was an anarchist, and he claimed that he had assassinated or attempted to assassinate William McKinley because McKinley was going around the country speaking about prosperity at a time where, according to Czolgosz, prosperity did not exist, quote unquote, for the working man. So Czolgosz took matters into his own hand and attempted to assassinate McKinley. McKinley died several days later, so it moved from attempted assassination to an actual assassination. And McKinley's assassination marked the literal end of one period and the beginning of a new period in American history. Much of the 19th century was dominated by a type of politics referred to as laissez-faire politics. The idea of laissez-faire politics is that the government keeps its hands out of business, that the government doesn't interfere very much in the day-to-day lives of average Americans. The laissez-faire era was also an age of imperialism, as we've discussed. It was an era of weak executive government in the United States. And as much as these things are all changing in 1901, there's also something else that's very remarkable and distinct changing in 1901. It thrust Theodore Roosevelt, a person no one had expected, and in fact, no one wanted to be the president of the United States. He becomes the president virtually against almost everybody's wishes. In 1900, excuse me, many Republicans opposed the idea of adding Theodore Roosevelt to the Republican Party ticket. He was nominated as vice president for the Republicans, but there were lots of Republicans who were against it. A senator from Ohio named Mark Hanna opposed it, saying that the Republicans were, quote, putting one heartbeat between the presidency and, quote, that damned cowboy. So why did Theodore Roosevelt get this nomination? Well, he was at that time, he was the governor of the state of New York. And while the governor of the state of New York, Roosevelt had challenged political party leaders there. He had challenged the Republican Party boss system at the city level in New York City. He had challenged corporate control over New York State. He went after all sorts of monopolistic business practices. And to put it very simply, the business community and political community of New York State wanted Roosevelt gone. They didn't care how he was out of the state, but they just wanted him out of the state of New York. So a New York senator named Thomas Platt basically convinced the National Republican Party to put Theodore Roosevelt on the ticket as the vice presidential candidate for William McKinley's reelection bid. Now, the vice presidency, it's important to note, the vice presidency was not viewed the same way as it is today. It was looked at as little more than ceremonial. People did not look at it as a job that a person wanted if they were looking to get ahead. It was the sort of kind of capstone to a career that was kind of just short of being a presidential level, but still a person who had a fair amount of influence. So the thought was very clearly, we can shut Theodore Roosevelt up if we put him in the vice presidency. But they were, all of these Republicans of 1900 completely underestimated Theodore Roosevelt and who he was and what his political ambitions were. Now, Theodore Roosevelt had been timid. He had been weak and sickly as a child. There was a very good chance, according to the doctors of the time, that he was going to die young. Nobody expected him to live to be a teenager when he was first born. At some point, his parents decided that the best way to make him comfortable and give him as easy a life as possible was to send him west, was to send him to places like Arizona, because the dry climate might provide a respite from his asthma and all sorts of other issues that he had. And he went there and he just developed dramatically. He wound up becoming kind of a He-Man of sorts. He started getting into all sorts of sporting activities. He became an expert horseman, a boxer. He swam, he hiked in the mountains, all sorts of stuff. And finally got to the point where he was he was an adult. He came home to New York State and decided that he was going to continue in the family's political tradition and run for the New York State legislature. Now, he's remarkable in that he gets elected to the New York State legislature at the age of 23, which is, it's just incredible, the rise that he's having here. But then in 1884, on Valentine's Day of all days, his mother and his wife died on the same day. His wife died while giving birth to the couple's first child. His mother died later that night due to a heart attack, and the heart disease had actually been masked by symptoms of cholera, so nobody knew she was even sick. But both of them died on that same day, and this sent Theodore Roosevelt into a spiral of depression. And once again, he looked to the West as his respite from all of this stuff. Now it's a mental health retreat of sorts. And he leaves and goes off to Montana, essentially to become a cowboy. He tends a cattle ranch. He rides and he hunts and goes into Canada and rides and hunts and all of this stuff. And finally, when he decided that he was ready to come back, he came back again and once again entered the political realm. He became the police commissioner of the city of the city of New York. He was very important as a political figure at that point, rooting out corruption and basically creating the New York City Police Department as we know it today. He wound up eventually becoming the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And while he was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, he was so convinced that he was going to miss out on the fight that was the Spanish-American War that he actually resigned his post as Assistant Secretary of the Navy so that he could outfit a volunteer cavalry unit and volunteer for service in the Spanish-American War. Now, he did so well in all of that that he actually wound up winning a Congressional Medal of Honor as a consequence of this. It was awarded to him posthumously, but his exploits were considered to be that impressive in the war that he got this Congressional Medal of Honor. And then he used his celebrity and his status as a war hero to springboard himself to the governorship of the state of New York and ultimately, obviously, the vice presidency of the United States. Now, Theodore Roosevelt is a man of incredible contradictions, which is one of the things that makes him one of the more interesting personalities of American history. Regardless of whether you like the things that he did or didn't do, he's certainly one of the more unique personalities. Theodore Roosevelt was from one of the United States' wealthiest families. Before the Kennedy family, the Roosevelt family was as close to a political dynasty as the United States would have, and he was from that family. But instead of using that wealth as many other wealthy people did, Roosevelt attacked wealthy business owners in this country as he put it, quote, malefactors of great wealth, meaning that these are people who amass an incredible amount of wealth and then go out and do bad things with that wealth, as opposed to being benefactors, people who do good things with their wealth. He was the first president to be born in an urban setting, New York City. And yet he was also one of the world's great conservationists. He was almost single-handedly responsible for the national park system, for example. He was also an incredibly warlike man. He certainly believed that war was what literally made, quote unquote, manhood, turned boys into men. But he also won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1906 for helping negotiate an end to a war between Russia and Japan that was ongoing at that point. Now, Theodore Roosevelt was also different in that he transformed the presidency of the United States in a number of ways. Roosevelt was not like the presidents that you've heard me discuss up to this point in class. And I've really only mentioned a couple of them. And the thing that they all seem to have in common was that they were willing to cede power and control in government to Congress and let Congress run things. Roosevelt is different. Theodore Roosevelt believed that the president was the moral leader of the United States, and he actually called the White House his quote unquote bully pulpit. He believed that as the moral leader of this country, he's in a position to make people believe certain things and to convince them to do things because this is the right way to do them. This is the right thing to do. And he had a responsibility to use that power. As president of the United States, he broke up trust agreements. He created the Labor Department. The whole reason to create the Labor Department was to actually look out for working people in the United States, to say that the government is actually on the side of workers for a change, as opposed to on the side of those, quote, malefactors of great wealth. He also was responsible for creating the Interstate Commerce Commission in the United States, creating the first real labor laws in this country. In 1904, Roosevelt won re-election by what at that point was the largest margin in American political history. Now, in 1908, he absolutely could have run for a third term, but he believed that it was irresponsible to run for a third term. So he said he was stepping down, but he also basically handpicked his own successor. He said that William Howard Taft was the right guy to succeed him as the president of the United States. Sorry about that little glitch there. William Howard Taft was the right guy to succeed him. And so if you, quote, would vote for me, then you should vote for William Howard Taft. And William Howard Taft won easily in 1908. By 1912, Roosevelt had had a falling out with Taft and decided that he was going to run for a third term as president because Taft had just completely messed up the entire job. And in doing so, Roosevelt wound up adding a third, quote unquote, progressive to the 1912 campaign and creating a split amongst progressive voters that allowed a guy named Woodrow Wilson to become president. So Roosevelt won two elections, he won two elections, or won one election, lost another election, and then wound up directly influencing a third election. Now, a lot of times when people think about what the United States is in terms of politics, most people think of the big division in our country as being liberal and conservative. And it's easy to think of that because there's a sort of what's called recency bias in this country, that, you know, what happened last is the most important thing, and it's the way things have always been. But the reality is that in many foreign countries, they look at Americans and think that Americans basically all believe the same thing. We might lean a little bit differently on certain ideas. There might be certain social areas that we lean differently on, but more or less, we all believe the same basic thing. And Theodore Roosevelt gave a name to this type of politics. The idea is called progressivism, and progressivism in one form or another dominated American politics from 1901 until 1980 in some form or fashion. Now, 1901 is the beginning point because it is the start of Theodore Roosevelt's term in office. 1980 is the ending point because it is the beginning of Ronald Reagan's term in office. And Ronald Reagan was very specifically against the main core idea of progressivism. The core belief of progressivism is this notion that the government can act as an instrument of reform. The government can come in and identify problems and fix those problems. The government should be an activist, as opposed to laissez-faire, where the government but basically held the idea that we should keep our hands out of these sorts of things. Progressivism said absolutely not. Now, why I say Reagan was against that core principle, I mean, when Reagan ran for president in 1980, one of his more famous campaign statements was that the 10 most dangerous words in the English language were, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." So he was very anti-progressive in that sense. He absolutely hated this core concept of government intervention. Now, Theodore Roosevelt, in saying that the government should be an activist entity, sketched out basically everything that the progressives are going to do in the 20th century. Even if Roosevelt isn't going to be president throughout all of this, and he's not going to be able to see everything that gets accomplished, Roosevelt lays out the bulk of that agenda. For example, Roosevelt advocated a progressive or graduated income tax, meaning that the more money you make, your taxes go up progressively with your income. So you pay one tax rate on, say, $0 through 25,000. You pay another tax rate on $25,001 through 50,000, and then another tax rate on $50,001 through 100,000, and on and on. So the idea that we have today, tax brackets for different levels of your income, that's the progressive idea. That's a progressive income tax or graduated income tax. Theodore Roosevelt, despite being from one of the nation's wealthiest family, advocated for an inheritance tax. He advocated for a national banking system to create a more rational way of managing the nation's income and managing the nation's deposits and how we disperse money and even our monetary system. All of that would be managed by this rationally created national banking system. He also favored a system of government regulation that was based on commissions of experts. And these commissions of experts would ensure things like the fairness in business practices, the fairness of commercial enterprises, consumer fairness, purity of certain products. And it would be all of these systems, commissions would be overseen by experts. So if you've got a body like, for example, the Congressional Budget Office, it's going to be overseen by accountants, by people who have actual experience in being a budget officer and managing budgets, as opposed to just somebody who was important to a campaign for some politician. So all of this stuff is new within the system of the United States. Essentially, progressives believed that the government had a vital role in helping people in this country achieve the promise of the American dream, and the government should be active in doing that. Now, progressivism took a lot of different fronts. There were all sorts of different quote unquote fights, if you will, that were being undertaken by the progressive movement. For example, there's a progressive movement within education led by educators like John Dewey. John Dewey, for example, advocated for relevance in education. He, for example, thought that we ought to have a basic curriculum. There should be certain things that every student should learn along the way. But, he thought that that should be expanded from things like reading, writing, and arithmetic, the traditional stuff, to include things like health and sexual education, that there should be things about hygiene classes, so that people know just, how to stay safe from disease, how to engage in certain activities without spreading disease, and all of that sort of stuff is part of the curriculum, or should be, according to guys like John Dewey. He believed in increasing the amounts of money that were spent on vocational training for obvious reasons. He thought, sure, it's great to fund a traditional style of education, that people should obviously be encouraged if they want to go in and learn, what we call the STEM subjects right now, or liberal arts curricula. All of that is great, and we should encourage that sort of stuff. But he also said, look, there are people who are not interested in that and are never going to be interested in that. And it's not an attack on them. It's not an attack on their intellectual abilities, because I'm sure you all who are listening to this or watching this know people like this, people who are smart, but they couldn't care less about reading about history. But if you give them a car and you tell them, hey, why don't you rebuild this engine, they're a whiz at rebuilding the engine. So it's not about their intellectual capabilities, it's about where their interests reside. And Dewey thought we should encourage that stuff by increasing vocational training. He also thought there should be, in terms of how we teach students and how we assess their learning, we ought to move away from things like memorization. We ought to move away from that. It's not that it doesn't have its place, it certainly does have its place, but you shouldn't learn a topic like history, for example, by just memorizing a bunch of dates and battles and presidential names. It's more important, as Dewey saw it, to be able to understand a set of core principles, or to understand events and to be able to explain how change is occurring, how processes happen. So he wanted a move away from memorization. And then he also thought one of the more important things for this country was we had to increase literacy, particularly among populations where there were low literacy rates. And in this regard, the progressives did a lot and had a ton of success. For example, curriculums changed across the country. African-American literacy rates, African-Americans were one of the groups in society that had incredibly low literacy rates headed into the 20th century. But by 1920, that literacy rate among the African-American community had gone from 43% to 77%, which is remarkable. That is an absolutely remarkable achievement. There were also public health advocates who argued that public health needed to be something that the government takes an active role in handling, that we need to get rid of certain diseases. We need to use a government program to get rid of things like hookworm and diphtheria. They are going to push for the pasteurization of milk to make it easier for companies to come in and do stuff like that, so that we can do things like decrease the infant mortality rate. In a previous lecture, I told you that the infant mortality rate dropped dramatically because of the pasteurization of milk. By 1930, the infant mortality rate in this country had decreased by 90%. So it was simply a remarkable accomplishment. We also had urban progressives who believed that the government should take a role in creating green spaces and places where people can engage in recreation, where they can engage in art appreciation or music appreciation, have clean cities and clean places to live. So urban progressives did things like erect public parks. They would build libraries that were free and open to the public, museums that were free and open to the public. They advocated the creation of clean water and sewage delivery systems to the cities, to homes in the nation's cities. And they also favored things like the elimination of red light districts as a way of saying we need to take care of the public health as well. Progressives advocated a type of economic structure in this country, and this is something that marks them a little bit different. Some of the things that we're going to hear about the progressives are going to sound very similar to what the populists had wanted. There is a clear line connecting the populists and the progressives in terms of a sort of reform spirit of sorts. But where they are different. If you remember, the populists wanted a cooperative capitalist economy. What the progressives favored was what we're going to call welfare capitalism. Welfare capitalism. Now, welfare capitalism is a term that is actually very simple. I think a lot of times we hear these economic terms and we freeze up over economics, but it's actually very simple. Welfare capitalism suggests that capitalism is still the structure. It's each person should pursue their own economic self-interest. That part doesn't change. But why it's called welfare capitalism is Welfare capitalists suggest that capitalism itself is obviously an imperfect system, that people fall through the cracks, that they wind up losing, quote unquote, through no fault of their own. So what we need is a social safety net to protect those people who have fallen through those cracks. So welfare capitalists will advocate for things like old age pensions in this country, that, rather than, you having to create a retirement system through the employer that you work for, or as happened most of the time during this era, you better just save your money because, at some point you're not going to be able to work anymore, and you better hope you've saved so that you can still live. Well, here they're going to say that the government should actually get involved in managing some sort of system for an old age pension in this country. They also favored public work programs in cases of national economic catastrophe, so that people, no matter where they are, no matter what point they've reached in life, they'll still have some ability to have their basic needs met and to be able to consume within the national economy. Now, progressivism also took a turn into the arts, into what we would call liberal arts. Progressivism within the art community saw works that were emphasizing abstract and modern concepts as opposed to classical portraiture. Within the social sciences, like history, for example, scholars emphasized conflict and dissonance among different groups, as opposed to suggesting that all of American history had been a story where everybody just kind of linked arms together in common cause and marched in one direction toward a common goal. Progressive historians said, no, that's not true. Americans were always fighting with one another about who's going to control resources and who's going to control the political dialogue and all sorts of other different things. There's a whole new vocabulary that gets associated with the idea of progressivism, as words like and phrases like feminist, social worker, social science, human rights, conservation, and all sorts of other things are going to enter our lexicon and become part of the words that we use to describe the world around us. So progressivism is not just an economic thing. It's not just a social thing. It has all of these other levels where it's taking hold and having a strong influence. Now, progressivism also had a sort of unsavory side. Some would even argue an ugly side to it. The progressive movement itself was a movement of college-educated and upper middle class people. Again, despite the connections between and similarities that we can see from the populists to the progressive movement, it's totally different groups that are driving the movement. Progressivism is driven by college-educated upper middle class people with college education, with values that are brought about by a college education and upper middle class living. Okay, and if you want to think about what type of difference that is, think about people who live in the third ward and how they look at life, what their outlook on life might be, as opposed to, again, to use Houston as an example, people who live in River Oaks and how they see the world and what they think the keys to success are. They have two completely different ideas based on the way they live their lives. Okay, so progressivism is going to be driven more by these college-educated upper middle class people, as opposed to urban people who are barely scraping by, or rural peoples or anything like that. And a lot of times what they do, the things that they advocate, reflect their values and reflect on some level a simplistic way of looking things. Some would argue a naive way of looking at things. One historian, I think probably hit it best, was that what they really did was that they simplified problems, and the issue that they created was a problem of, as he put it, unintended consequences. That their motives might have been good, and the things that they were trying to do were undoubtedly good, quote unquote, overall for society. But then they wind up, once they put these reforms in, they wind up creating a whole new set of problems. And we can see this in one of the problems that I alluded to a couple of slides back, the idea of eliminating a red light district. Progressives in this country absolutely thought that red light districts represented a massive public health crisis in this country, that there were these areas where vice was legal. Virtually every city had a so-called red light district where these types of vices were legal, where prostitution was legal, gambling was legal, alcohol consumption was legal if the general populace had passed laws that made alcohol consumption or purchases illegal. It was legal within the red light district. So all sorts of vices were going on in these red light districts. But by 1920, across the country, progressives had, for the most part, gotten rid of red light districts. Now, the thing that they targeted the most was prostitution. They looked at prostitution as being this huge scourge in this country, that it was something that led to the spread of disease. It broke up families. It caused all sorts of crises. So we got to get rid of prostitution. Now, by 1920, they've gotten rid of the red light districts, but they have not, and I hope you all are aware, and I hope this isn't too much for delicate sensibilities, but they certainly haven't gotten rid of prostitution. Okay, the elimination of the red light district changed how prostitution was organized. Prior to the elimination, when red light districts were still around, prostitution existed and was done primarily in private homes under the control of madams, which meant that not only were the sex workers women, but the people in charge of the industry were, for the most part, women. However, once you get rid of the red light district, which progressives do, I'm going to hit that point again, they get rid of the red light districts. What winds up happening is that now that type of vice, every vice, but this particular type of vice that we're dealing with, it's illegal everywhere. So in order for it to flourish, it's going to mean that there's going to be a rise in corruption. There's going to necessarily be a rise in corruption because it can't continue to exist unless law enforcement is kind of looking the other way on it. And that type of corruption and the payoffs involved mean that there's going to be organized crime elements that are involved. There's going to be more violence involved in it. And all of this wound up shifting the control of the industry from women to men. So men are going to be in charge of this. And also, rather than happening in private housing, if you want to call it this, the prototype sex worker is going to be a streetwalker as opposed to somebody who works in a private home doing all of this stuff. So the progressives certainly had I suppose, a noble goal of sorts, if you want to look at it that way, in trying to eliminate the red light districts. But they also wound up altering this in a way that it was sort of unrecognizable. Another area where we can see this idea of unintended consequences is in the area of urban elections. Progressives believed that most city government was incredibly corrupt and controlled by local political bosses. And the progressives had two ways of dealing with this. They looked at those political bosses and said that the political bosses shut off access to competition within politics. And they also control too much of the day-to-day lives of these people because they're so entrenched within the nation's cities. They have too much power. So one way to eliminate the control of these political bosses is to get rid of the power that mayors have in a lot of these cities and put city managers in charge of these cities. People who are not necessarily elected officials, but appointed officials who have more budgetary control as opposed to control over all of these other aspects. The budget is the big thing that they control. The other thing that they're going to do across the nation's cities is they're going to institute what are called at-large elections. A lot of cities were broken up into boroughs or into wards or districts or whatever a person might want to call them, depending on the city. And if we're going to use a ward system, a city like Houston might have 7 or 8 or 9 wards. And a local politician would be in charge of that ward. So a politician from the first ward, for example, would only be answerable to people in the first ward. He's only got to depend on them to get elected every single election cycle. So, that person doesn't have to have a ton of money, some money, but not a ton. They're going to live amongst the people who live in that district. They're going to amass power. Everybody knows them, and everybody knows that their power means that they control resources, and that if you run afoul of them, your garbage may not get picked up, or you may not get clean water delivery in your home, or the streets might not get paved. The solution, at-large elections, means you just kind of take the map and you wipe all of those wards off, and all of the political leaders, like the city council, for example, instead of coming from the individual wards, they come from the entire city. So instead of having to appeal to voters in just that one little ward, a city councilman will have to appeal to everybody. And if you think about, again, a city like Houston with 4.5 million people, that means covering and obviously a ton of land. That means you're going to have to cover a lot of area. You're going to have to meet a lot of people. You're going to have to appeal to a broader number of people. And that appeal is going to cost you. It's going to need a lot of access to money. And what this does, the unintended consequence here, is that citywide elections mean that there's going to be the influence of money now, and it's going to knock out people of color. It's going to knock out ethnic minorities. Ethnic minorities and people of color are going to be more for elections in the North as opposed to in the South. But a lot of these people are not going to be able to run for political office because they don't actually have access to capital. So did it eliminate the power of the local political bosses? Sure. But it also brought in a massive amount of influence in terms of access to capital. Money is going to speak very loudly in these circumstances. Now, another area, a more direct and concrete example of this is sanitary meat and meat inspection. In 1906, a progressive journalist, a muckraker named Upton Sinclair, published a novel called The Jungle. Now, it was about the meat packing industry in Chicago. He fictionalized a lot of the stories of the people that he met while investigating the meat packing industry. He put this novel out hoping that people would actually be horrified about the treatment of the workers that they read about. But instead, what they seized on, people seized on the production of hot dogs in this country. They were horrified by how hot dog production went. They were horrified by how by all of the processes whereby meat was canned and packaged and all of this stuff. And they were horrified. They were just disgusted to find out that there were rats, that there were people who lost limbs in the industry, and there wasn't a process for making sure that, there were no standards about making sure that rat hair or rat droppings or people parts didn't wind up in the food we're consuming. So when people read this novel, they became horrified. Now, Europe, right off the bat, when this novel got published, European markets almost immediately boycotted American produced meat. So the meat packers themselves got together and they went to Congress and begged Congress to regulate them. They said, look, we've got to have some sort of system for meat inspection so that we can get back our access to these European markets. And Congress responds. They respond with the Sanitary Meat Inspection Act of 1906. And it's great. And it put aside a lot of fears that Americans had, because they said, well, now we've got an inspection system. Now we've got a way to make sure that, the meat that we're eating is actually the meat that they say it is, and all of that. But the ugly story, the ugly reveal in all of this is that the Sanitary Meat Inspection Act actually only applied to meat, or at least initially, only applied to meat exported to Europe. It did not apply to meat that was consumed in the United States. So these American meat packers could still do all of the same sorts of things that they were doing before. They didn't have to worry about any form of inspection or or certification. On top of that, the meat packing companies were the ones that wrote the legislation. The congressmen, in this case, did what congressmen today do, where they go to lobbyists basically, and they say, look, you tell us the legislation you want. You write the legislation, I'll sponsor it. That's what happened here. The meat packing companies themselves wrote the legislation. Congressmen sponsored it, got it passed, and ultimately got it signed. And what was disheartening about this is that the meat packing companies set in motion a system where the companies themselves would pay for the inspection process. Now, this benefited larger meat packing companies, the ones that had bigger margins, because they can build the cost of inspection into their marketing. They can build it into what they're doing. Smaller companies that have smaller margins, smaller profit margins, are not going to be able to build this in without really hurting. So ultimately, what meat inspection did was it gave Americans a false sense of security, but it also eliminated smaller companies. It wound up giving the larger companies a boost in terms of the type of competition that they had to deal with. They didn't have to deal with smaller businesses. Now, with all of this, why did progressivism arise? Well, one reason is very simple. I've already covered it. It's partly by accident. William McKinley's assassination. If William McKinley had not been assassinated, who knows when this would have happened? Progressivism was going to happen. There's no question about that. But having a progressive in the Oval Office was a boom for the progressive movement. It allowed progressivism to happen in a more rapid pace. Another reason why progressivism occurred was the activities of muckrakers, guys like Upton Sinclair, people like Ida B. Wells, investigative journalists that were looking into everything and exposing corruption in government, corruption in business, the poverty of the people, lynching, all sorts of things. They did all sorts of exposés into child labor, into meat production, lynching, as I mentioned. All of these things are done by muckrakers. Incidentally, they got their nickname from Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt referred to them as people who get down and dig around in the muck. Roosevelt, even though he benefited from muckrakers, didn't really have much use for muckrakers. He really didn't like them very much. And then a third reason we can look at and say this is why progressivism arose is something called the social gospel. Many of the people who inspired the progressive movements were religious men and women in the United States. Now, if you took 1301 with me, excuse me, you already know this because this happened in the 1800s as well, that religious movements inspired this stuff. They were looking for people who wanted to apply their religious sensibilities to the social problems that they saw going on around them. Now, when I say that, I don't mean that they're taking Bibles and going out and saying, oh, you're impoverished? Well, here, read this Bible. It'll solve all your problems. Excuse me. But rather, they're looking at the world around them. They see homelessness, they see poverty, they see people who are hungry. And they, this is literally a what would Jesus do type of thing. They're thinking, well, would Jesus step over a homeless person and go, God, that guy really needs to get a job? Or would Jesus try to feed him? So they've got an outlet for their religious sensibilities in terms of social problems. So this is why I say it's part of this sort of social gospel. Now, to continue along with the progressive movement in terms of its popularity and these sort of negative sides, there's a lot of things that happen in the progressive era that are both good and bad, much like a lot of things in American history. For example, a product of the progressive era was somebody you've already heard of, W.E.B. Du Bois. We don't really need to go into a lot of the things that we talked about with Du Bois earlier about his split with Booker T. Washington and his ideas about confrontation. But Du Bois was very highly critical of the way American history had been presented throughout the late 1800s and the early 1900s. The way history was taught was something called the Dunning School interpretation, and that's what I've got up here on the screen as the quote unquote accepted version of Reconstruction. It was called the Dunning interpretation, Dunning, after a historian from Columbia University. What this professor, James Dunning, argued was that everything was fine in the United States until the Civil War happened. The Civil War occurred, it ended slavery, and all of a sudden, the former slaves got the vote. They became participants in the political process, and all hell broke loose. Corruption reigned, that quote unquote African Americans took over the country. They were forcing whites to serve as slaves. None of this is actually true, but they were forcing whites to serve as slaves. They were engaging in just an incredible amount of corruption as they ran the governments of the South. And it was only when a group of courageous white revolutionaries that he referred to as, quote, redeemers, retook control across the South and eliminated all of this corruption, quote unquote, put blacks back in their place and restored order. Now, that's the accepted version of how Reconstruction was, the post-Civil War era was, well into the 1930s. Du Bois wrote a decisive work, a 1,300-page work that blew apart all of these arguments. Okay, he pointed out, he demolished every part of this. He pointed out that most African Americans did not actually get access to the ballot until the 1870s. And then when they did, their time as active voters was actually very short in this country. He pointed out that there was not one single state legislature, not even one, where African Americans were even close to a majority, let alone the United States Congress or the United States Senate. So this idea of blacks being in a position where they could actually do all of these things wasn't possible. It just simply didn't hold up to scrutiny. He pointed out that despite these attacks of corruption, the African American legislators that were in positions across the South, they did things like expand the public school year. They expanded public spending on education. They did all sorts of things that were actually beneficial to the state populaces, and all of that stuff wound up getting rolled back by these redeemers. And then, of course, Du Bois also pointed out the massive economic crisis that was sharecropping and crop lien and all of this other stuff. So he demolished all of this stuff. However, all of this stuff that Du Bois wound up writing fell in a lot of ways on deaf ears because a lot of Americans weren't interested in hearing it. In part, they weren't interested in hearing it because W.E.B. Du Bois was African American, but it also turned out that his political radicalism was also a bit of trouble for him. He was openly a socialist, and a lot of people heard that and said, "Well, whatever he's saying, I don't want to hear it because I don't want to hear what socialists have to say." So he wound up not really being taken seriously with this book. The book wound up basically kind of being shelved. You've got a Harvard University PhD who writes this monumental work, and most people don't even hear about it until the 1960s. And when it wound up being revealed, when it was found, quote unquote, in the 1960s, virtually every historian in this country who dealt with African American history wound up examining it and coming to the conclusion that this is the guy who's got it right and everybody else has had it wrong all of these years. So he's really important and influential, but there's obviously a cost to Du Bois. Also, we see the high point of labor unions in the United States during the Progressive era. This is a moment where labor unions are absolutely on the rise during the Progressive era. In 1902, Theodore Roosevelt kind of broke with our political and labor tradition in this country by doing something that no president had ever actually done. He intervened in a labor dispute on the side of the workers in an anthracite coal mine in West Virginia. The coal mining company in question had begun cutting wages. The workers wound up talking about going out on strike. The mining company actually told them that if they tried to go out on strike, they would hire non-union workers. Ultimately, what the company wound up doing was they locked the workers out. They literally put up fences and locked out the miners, brought in the non-union workers, and frankly, Theodore Roosevelt in this circumstance told the mine owners that if you don't negotiate in good faith with these miners, I will send the United States Army in and they will reopen those mines and they will protect the miners, not you guys. So he intervened on the side of labor, which was simply remarkable. This led to a massive increase in labor union membership starting in the early 1900s. By 1905, a new labor union had emerged in this country called the Industrial Workers of the World, or IWW. They gained an incredible amount of ground and had just literally hundreds of thousands of members across the country. Now, this is a different type of labor union. The IWW was not talking bread and butter unionism. As we talked about in the last mod with the American Federation of Labor, the IWW doesn't favor bread and butter unionism. They want worker control of the factories. They argue that the workers are the ones who are producing wealth, so the workers should be enjoying a piece of the wealth that's generated. They also became sort of a synergistic part of the American Socialist Party during this era. The American Socialist Party grew by leaps and bounds during this era, to the point that the Socialist Party was routinely garnering more than 1 million votes in national elections. They had a newspaper circulation of greater than 200,000, which meant that the American Socialist Party's newspaper was one of the biggest newspapers in the country. Plus, there were more than 120 elected officials in this country, including several mayors who were actually openly members of the Socialist Party, not fake socialists today, where, if you happen to have any sort of left-leaning tendency, people go, oh, well, you're a socialist. These were real, honest to God socialists, and openly socialists, and they're running for and winning elective offices. So it's at a time that there is real change in this country. There's a real period of what people would call ferment during this early period. It reached its high point, the progressive era reached its high point in 1912 when Woodrow Wilson, a progressive Democrat, won the presidential election with 42% of the vote. Now, by winning 42% of the vote, he only won a plurality. He certainly did not win a majority. His electoral victory, in fact, obviously depended on the Electoral College, where he did win a majority. But the reason I mentioned his 42% of the vote was that William Howard Taft also ran as a progressive Republican. Theodore Roosevelt ran as a third-party candidate. His party was literally called the Progressive Party. But what's remarkable about this election in 1912 is that among those three guys, they garnered 83% of the vote in the United States. If 83% of the people are voting for an identified progressive candidate, that means it's a progressive nation. There's no other way to describe that. So this is a remarkable moment. And if we were to say that this person, so pick a person, this person is sort of the avatar for the progressive movement. If Theodore Roosevelt isn't it, then Woodrow Wilson is it. Wilson was a thoroughly modern president. He was the first president since John Adams all the way back in 1800 to personally address the Congress. Most presidents thought that Congress was so separate from the executive branch that the president should not even step foot in Congress. So they didn't. Between John Adams and Woodrow Wilson, none of them actually did. He also was the first president to write and submit his own budget, as opposed to just turning the whole process over to Congress and saying, well, you tell me what the budget is. He created an idea called the imperial presidency, where the executive branch kind of reaches out and takes power from the congressional branch. He was also very much like all of the other progressives. When I talked about how the progressive movement emerges, Wilson was a very deeply moralistic person. He saw the United States as kind of the moral leader of the world. Not only is the president the moral leader of the country, the United States is the moral leader of the world. In regard to Mexico, for example, in 1913, the president of Mexico, a guy named Francisco Madero, was assassinated, and Wilson's response to this is, quote, "We will teach Latin Americans to elect good men." He saw this assassination of Madero as a moral failing on the parts of people within Mexico. He also used these moral sensibilities to invade Mexico. He waited for a fight to break out between U.S. Marines and Mexican civilians in Tampico. He used that as a pretext to invade Mexico through both Tampico and Veracruz. Once the United States Navy was actually in Tampico and Veracruz, not only did they funnel money and weapons to various opposition figures during the Mexican Revolution, but Wilson also used them to carry out prototypical progressive agenda items like building sewer systems and building clean water delivery systems and fortifying port structures and building seawalls and stuff like that to protect port cities. So he's got this sort of imperialism of idealism, as one historian called it, that yes, we invaded this country, but we're doing it with good intentions. And he also authorized the United States Army with that same idea. He invaded the United States Army to invade Mexico on multiple occasions after all of this, especially in 1916, in attempts to try to invade Francisco Pancho Villa as a way of influencing what was going on with the Mexican Revolution. But Wilson was a prototypical Democrat, or excuse me, a prototypical progressive in another way. He's not just doing all of this stuff and saying that moralism is guiding all of this, we're doing all of this for the right reason. He also had that dark side to him, if you will. There was a movie that came out during Wilson's first term, the tail end of Wilson's first term. It was a movie called Birth of a Nation. Birth of a Nation portrayed that so-called Dunning School in a movie form. It portrayed former slaves just running amok, literally forcing whites to serve them at gunpoint, raping and pillaging with impunity across the South until the heroic Ku Klux Klan came in. They rode in to save the day. Now, I'm not saying heroic is not my word. That's the intention of the author of the book that this movie was based on, and it was the intention of the filmmaker, a guy named D.W. Griffith. It was a silent movie, and they played this incredibly heroic movie every time the Ku Klux Klan showed up on screen, so the viewer got the signal that these are the heroes of this movie. Wilson arranged for a screening of The Birth of a Nation at the White House. He was not interested in going to a theater to see it, so he arranged for a screening at the White House. And when Wilson saw it, Wilson, who had a PhD in history, by the way, and should have known better, looked at this movie and said, it's like history written with lightning. It's like God himself had come down and used his hand and used it to inscribe this in stone, just like he did supposedly the 10 Commandments. So Wilson saw this as absolute, complete truth about what happened in post-Civil War America. He also, as president, instituted a civil service program, which was good, but then he also required that there be that applicants attach a photograph of themselves so that the interviewers or the screeners would know, just who's applying for this, and they could kind of eliminate certain applicants. Nonetheless, it is during Woodrow Wilson's presidency that we see the high point of the progressive era. During Woodrow Wilson's presidency, the government actually lowered tariffs as a way of encouraging more competition within the marketplace. They got that so-called progressive or graduated income tax established. The Congress also created, and Wilson signed, the act that created the Federal Trade Commission to make sure that the marketplace was more fair. The Congress also passed for, at Wilson's direction, they passed something called the Clayton Antitrust Act, which prohibited quote unquote non-competitive pricing. We've had two examples of non-competitive pricing in the class this semester. Now, they happen in the material for Mod 1, but if you think back to Mod 1 and you remember the Pittsburgh Plus pricing scheme, that was non-competitive pricing. It put an unfair burden on people outside of Pittsburgh as a way to stifle competition, as were J.P. Morgan's railroad surcharges. They were all non-competitive pricing. They hindered competition, and they hindered development based on where people were. The Congress also created the Federal Reserve System, which Wilson, as a candidate in 1912, supported. So when it got passed in 1913, Wilson signed the act. He also favored and supported the establishment of the first workers' compensation laws in this country. And Wilson was also behind the passage of 4 constitutional amendments in this country. The 16th Amendment, which permitted the income tax, the 17th Amendment, which created the direct election of senators, took that power away from the states and it put it in the hands of the people. The 18th Amendment, which prohibited alcohol manufactures and sales in this country, and the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote. So this progressive era absolutely did alter the world that these people lived in. But as we're going to see, all good things come to an end, and the progressive era is no different. A lot of times when we have these moments of progressive reform, we also have something that comes in, that happens, that just stops that reform dead in its tracks. And typically it's a war, and this progressive era is no different. So in our next lecture, we're going to be discussing about the thing that killed the progressive era, that being World War I. So join me for that next lecture. See you next time.